once again, everyone. I'm Edmund DeVoe, president of the New Jersey Cannabis Business Association, the state's first and remains the largest trade association for the cannabis industry. Before we get to our speakers today, just want to encourage everyone to put your name, your contact information in the chat feature. Tell us what it is that you do in the cannabis industry, and you can also share questions in the chat feature as well. Before we get started, I would also like to thank our sponsors. I'd like to thank Hans Construction, Sprague Energy, our preferred energy partners, Financial Resources Federal Credit Union, Curaleaf, Burton Trent Public Affairs, HBK Accounting, Township Green, a new retail facility, new retailer, Proteus 420, Saks LLP, Dutchy, Puffin Entrepreneurs and Investors, Canna Remedies, and DM Labs LLC. Well, everyone, thanks once again for joining us. We have two wonderful guests today. We have Bob Miller from ACT Labs and Adam Gersh of Flaster Greenberg. So before we get to Adam, Bob, I'd like to welcome you to Lunch and Learn.
Thank you so much, Ed. So what I'd like to do for a few minutes is really share with some things that we're doing at ACT Laboratories and how the whole industry, I believe, could benefit from. But before I do that, let me just first share a little bit for those that don't know ACT Laboratory, what we do. So we're a contract testing laboratory. We're currently in 5 states. We're in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and New York. Soon to be in Florida and Massachusetts, and then ultimately in New Jersey. I personally born and raised in New Jersey, so very much appreciate this space and what it's doing. My background's in the pharmaceutical industry as heads of quality at major companies like J&J, Pfizer, and also Gilead. But the program that we've just recently launched is a concept that we're calling trust and testing. And when you look, and what's really been the driver for it? So when you look around us, the whole space of what I'd say customer confidence in testing has really gotten to a point of there's just a lot of questions out there, and thankfully not in New Jersey yet, but in multiple states, there's lawsuits going on about really challenges about what is the accuracy of the data that I'm generating. And those have gotten to sort of I'd say somewhat of a fever pitch, even now that there's even some lawsuits out there about collusion, whereby there's alleged that grower processors are colluding with laboratories to create, in particular, inflated potency numbers. And at the end of the day, when you kind of say that, so what's the impact, right? The impact is obviously potentially to the consumer. They are obviously paying more because it has higher potencies, or the product isn't nearly as reliable. So what we're doing in concert with another laboratory is the beginnings of what we're calling this trust and testing composition, where it's open up to all laboratories. And what that will do is we believe we could do additional requirements over and above what's required in any one state. And to be able to say, if you meet these specific categories, what can you then be able to attest to? And what that really means is the following. We're really focused in 4 major areas. Those relate to the customer experience. So a lot related to when you get a certificate of analysis, which is the summary of the data we're generating. Is there consultative capabilities for people to be able to understand the data, help resolve issues? So there's a component I'm gonna call related to the customer experience. The second pillar of this trust and testing concept is that how do you ensure greater, accurate, reliable data? And what that really means is we have a proficiency test that's required today. We recommend doing it more frequently than just once a year is what we're doing today. So as part of the certification process, we're suggesting you do that more than that. We're also looking at round robin testing. So for those that don't know, one of the things you can always do is to say, okay, if I test the same sample in multiple laboratories, what do I get? So what we're suggesting as part of this program is that we would have round robin testing being done as part of this concept. So that's like second pillar we're calling accurate, reliable testing. The third pillar is quality and quality management systems. So myself being in quality for over 35 years in pharma, it's a special place in my heart. But how do you have the appropriate quality systems inside your laboratory so it's prescriptive on what kinds of things you need to have in place to say you have an effective quality assurance program? And then the fourth one relates to integrity. And integrity takes on multiple components. A, you have to have a history of successful inspections. Second, you want to ensure that there hasn't been any data integrity issues that have been reported by that specific laboratory working with the state in which you do business. But probably the biggest piece is an enhanced, what we call ISO 17025 program. For those that don't know, you have to be ISO certified. And I honestly think that ISO certification doesn't go far enough to ensure the reliability of the data. So if you can imagine, there's these four pillars. We're now putting in criteria to say what are those pillars entail. And then this would be open to any laboratory anywhere in the country, so that there would be an independent group that would oversee this program. And to say, if you meet these enhanced attributes, you could say that you have the trust and testing seal. I'll call it seal of approval, sake of a better word. And what it would also allow people is it allow for grower processors to potentially, assuming it's acceptable in your individual state, be able to put that trust and testing on your label that your product has been tested by one of these laboratories. So that's the program in a nutshell, where I'd say we'll be going live with the program in a couple of months. We're putting together the oversight committee now, which needs to be an independent group of people. It's surely not being owned by ACT Laboratories. We're just trying to create the program, working with a laboratory called SC Laboratories, which mostly has locations out west. But with the two laboratories together, we'll be covering about 11 or 12 states. So we'll have a pretty good view of that. So we went live with the announcement that we're putting this program together. It actually got picked up by Forbes, which was kind of interesting. So there is that interest. And the response that we've gotten have been incredibly positive. But what's surprising, it's coming from a lot of different groups than you would expect from laboratories and grower processors. They'd be asking, well, how do I do this? What does it entail? How do I sign up? That was expected. What's really interesting is we're getting it now from other groups. So there's an insurance company that reached out to us and said, hey, wait a minute. I do liability insurance and I insure grower processors. So therefore, is it not a de-risking of my relationship with that grower processor if I use one of those laboratories? Never anticipated that question or a comment that, hey, they want to be part of this. Another group that reached out to us is the banking industry and say, well, wait a minute, if I'm really financing these companies, would there be a reduced risk? Because, if they have, the testing buttoned up there, the chances of lawsuits are lower. So therefore, there's that component. We're also hearing from companies that are relying on testing, i.e. companies that sell mitigation equipment. So if you have product that fails, you can treat your product sometimes, depending on the nature of the failure, and say, well, geez, I'm dependent on reliable data. So we're getting this sort of what I call this effect of the many tentacles trying to say, hey, I want to be part of this program and tell me how we'd sign up. So I just wanted to share what we're doing here. Again, it is not a marketing tool. It's an effort by laboratories to just kind of raise all our standards, what we believe for the betterment of the consumer, ultimately, and to ensure that there's accurate, reliable data and what is in the product is on the label. So
that's great information. Thank you so much, Bob. That's great information. And it's really encouraging to see collaborative efforts in the industry. And so I had a question and you answered it for me already. And my question was actually going to be, well, who in the cannabis industry should be reaching out to you? Is it just the plant touching businesses? And you've answered that, and clearly not, that your efforts affect different markets or different silos within the cannabis industry. And that's also encouraging. So people should reach out to you, even if they're questioning, should they, they should reach out to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There is a website for the program right now. It's www.trustintesting.org. But if people would like to reach out to me directly, if you may have some individual questions, be more than happy to field those. There are a number of labs that want to sign up. We're sort of putting them on a waiting list. We haven't really gone forward with it. We want to make sure all the infrastructure and governance processes and confidentialities and things along those lines are all completed. And we're also working with some of the certifying agencies to see if they'd like to create what we're calling the enhanced 1705 audit process. So all those things are in progress right now, and would be more than happy if anybody has any questions or interest to join or have questions how it'd be run. I'd be more happy to answer them.
Well, that's great, Bob. So what I'd like you to do is put in the chat some of that information, how people can reach the Trust in Labs website, and clearly how they should get in touch with you. So this is interesting because we're talking about compliance, and compliance takes on many different faces. So laboratory testing, quality assurance is clearly an area of compliance. And I'll use this as an opportunity to actually segue to Adam Gersh. Adam is going to talk about labor peace agreements, which is in and of itself another form of compliance. When we talk about making application here in the state of New Jersey, one of the check marks that you have to have is that you've spoken with professional labor organizations. So Adam, I'd like to welcome you to Lunch and Learn as well.
Thank you so much, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak. I appreciate it. By way of a little bit of background, I am a labor and employment lawyer and part of our cannabis group at Flaster Greenberg. We are a full service law firm, and the cannabis industry requires full service. There are tax issues, there are real estate issues, there are labor and employment issues, there are environmental issues, there are corporate structuring issues and finance issues, among others. No family law issues to my knowledge, hopefully. And it is an interesting sort of legal crossroads that we find ourselves in, right? Who would have thought in 2023 in New Jersey, you could buy legal cannabis, but the plastic baggie that you would put it in is illegal. It's unusual. But with that said, the labor peace agreement has been a confounding issue for licensees and prospective licensees. And even once people have labor peace agreements, what to do with them, what do they mean, how to implement them, has also been confounding. So I want to provide some perspective on that today for our group. By way of background, I am a management side labor and employment attorney. So I typically represent businesses and management. But nonetheless, the unions are my partners on the other side of the table in many instances. And, unlike a union, unlike a non-union negotiation where you're dealing with an employee, for instance, who's been terminated, and you don't have an ongoing relationship, this is an ongoing relationship between management and unions regularly. So it does, it requires some thought and some consideration. But let's start from the beginning. What is a labor peace agreement? Because I think that's a confusing term and is often confused with what's called a collective bargaining agreement, or a CBA. And they really are different. So I'll start by describing the collective bargaining agreement, which is the agreement you have when you have majority support for a union, either because they've been voted in a formal election, or the support was overwhelming enough that management decided to voluntarily recognize the union as the bargaining group. And those are the things you read about in the paper when there's a strike over terms and conditions of employment, or brinksmanship, or any of those things that come close and affect your delivery of services as a consumer, whether it's a rail strike or a transportation strike or any of those things. That is not a labor peace agreement, right? In order to have a collective bargaining agreement, you have to have employees who have asked to be recognized, who have asked to have a union be the recognized bargaining party for the employees. You can't do that when you don't have employees yet, or even if you have employees who have not expressed an interest in unionization. So the labor peace agreement really comes in before any kind of a collective bargaining agreement. And this is an agreement between management, not the employees, not the prospective bargaining group, but just management, the company, and the union. And there are many facets and ways that or elements that a labor peace agreement can include. Most typically, it's going to include a requirement for neutrality. So, whereas typically a management organization would have the right to express anti-union sentiment, or at least that it thinks the company runs better without a union, that is often waived in these labor peace agreements. And it says, you know, we'll take a neutral position. If our bargaining unit wants to unionize, it can. It's not agreeing to have a unionized workforce. Only the bargaining unit under the law can do that. Only the employees can agree to do that. The management can't decide who's going to bargain for the employees. The employees get to decide who's going to bargain for the employees, or the employees can decide they don't want a union. And so the labor peace agreement really is before there is a union in place, or a collective bargaining agreement, or a vote, or even a request by the workers to be represented by a union. What's the relationship? And in that pre sort of employee requesting a union phase, the labor peace agreement would dominate. And again, it will sometimes provide for access. So in other words, it may say that the union has an opportunity to come in for a set period of time and meet with new hires and talk about what the union can offer. Some of them I've seen have asked employers, and employers have agreed to waive the right to an election. In other words, typically what happens in a standard union election is you'd have a showing of interest by the bargaining unit members, which is requires a third of the bargaining unit members to sign a card that just says I'm interested. Doesn't mean I'm even going to vote in favor of the union, just says I'm interested, and then you have a vote, majority wins. However, labor peace agreements can say, for instance, if we have 50% of people sign cards saying they're interested or expressing an interest, we'll waive the election process. There's lots of technical aspects to those election processes, and lots of bases for challenge on both sides. So it certainly streamlines that process, which can be very favorable to employers. You know, if unionization is a fait accompli, you know, there may be some opportunities here to set up a relationship in a more efficient way, rather than going through the National Labor Relations Board, the disruption of an election. So, and of course, you don't have to agree to that, right? The terms of the labor peace agreement are not set out in the statute or any of the regulations. It's really up to the union and the employer to bargain for that. So the union's got certainly, I mean, it can withhold its agreement, so it would have some leverage on its end. The employer obviously can withhold its agreement and bargain with other unions to try to get the most favorable labor peace agreement it can get. But ultimately, both sides need to come to a labor peace agreement in order to satisfy the regulatory requirement that you have a labor peace agreement. I want to pause for a minute, because I think there's an important aspect to this that at least everybody should understand, which is that there are really significant questions about the viability of and the constitutionality of requiring a labor peace agreement. The Federal National Labor Relations Act protects both union and management's rights and their First Amendment rights to express their opinions, which may be negative, about the effects of unionization. Obviously, within the bounds of the law, you've got a lot of rights. You're waiving these rights in certain ways by the labor peace agreement, or at least, you know, bargaining those rights. There's a significant, incredible argument that in a licensure context, requiring a labor peace agreement is an overstep and is preempted by the National Labor Relations Act. In my research, that has yet to be challenged. Frankly, licensees are interested in getting a license and are not interested in the delay that a constitutional challenge will cause over this issue. It's been secondary. There are some significant business reasons, I think, that it's not been challenged. But I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that there is a material and significant opportunity to challenge that. Unlike, for instance, a labor peace agreement where the state is the owner of a property, right? I mean, if the state's bidding out construction, it needs to ensure that there is an agreement with the labor union so that we don't have labor disruption and supply disruption and all of those things. So there, where the state's the owner of a project, the right to have a labor peace agreement is much more well established. Here, it's just a licensee, and not to get overly political, but of course, you know, the government has concerns about making sure that we don't have disruption in cannabis supply, especially for the medical community, but just generally, right? I mean, it's the government said we have an interest in supplying and making sure there's access to cannabis in the state, and a labor disruption would interfere with our stated interest. That then, of course, raises this preemption argument. But generally, in my sort of taking off my academic hat on that aspect and giving practically, businesses are entering into these because they're more interested in the license than challenging this constitutional issue. Other states have put into place similar requirements. New Jersey did. We weren't the first, and nor are we, completely original on that. However, they haven't been challenged in other states either for much the same practical reason.
Right.
Ultimately, though, I would encourage any prospective licensee, or somebody who is looking to expand a license and needs a labor peace agreement, that you really ought to consult with experienced labor counsel, because you need to understand what you're getting into, what the implications are, and they are significant. From a management perspective, once you sign a labor peace agreement and you agree to neutrality, you've given the union easy access, right? And I mean that's part of the idea here. And ultimately, the decision will be up to the bargaining unit. But you've certainly removed a hurdle, and that may be beneficial. I mean, get you skilled workers and some consistency in terms of your labor costs, right? Because when you have a collective bargaining agreement, those things are negotiated, and you've got a schedule and you can budget around it and all of those things. So it's not I'm not commenting one way or the other on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's really just you need to know what you're getting into and what the implications are going forward. So I highly recommend people consult with experienced labor counsel, and look at the different terms of the labor peace agreement and how that might be consistent with your business or inconsistent, and try to negotiate what you think you
So that was just like I was going to ask Bob, who should be reaching out to you, right? So we have these licensing categories. We have cultivation, manufacturing, retail, soon to be delivery, warehouse distribution. So of the 5 licensing categories, exclusive of laboratory testing, I'm assuming all 5, regardless of where you want to submit your application, people should be speaking to someone like yourself about this subject.
I agree. I think the more you can understand the labor peace agreement and by the way, even if you have an ancillary business, security or something like that doesn't require licensing, it's still, understanding what the implications are and how to address organized labor are important. Organized labor has made significant inroads into the cannabis industry, successfully made significant inroads. In fact, it's really been a driving force, both politically, there's a lot of power in these unions, and they've been successful in their lobbying efforts to try to help and move the industry forward, and to try to increase the terms and conditions for workers. But if you're in the business, you need to understand what that means, what that looks like, how it may affect your business, and how to work. If your employees do elect to be unionized, then you need to understand how to work with the union appropriately, and understand how that there are things you can do, certainly to try to discourage unionization, but there's things you need to do to work with a union if they're elected, or if you welcome them. So
okay,
each step is really about each step in the process is really about looking at where you want to be at the end of the process and trying to adjust your behavior and your conduct in a way that suits that ultimate end goal.
Thank you so much, Adam. That's great information. So as we near the end of today's Lunch and Learn, Bob, I want to come back to you briefly, and Adam, I'm going to ask you the same question, but for your particular subject matter expertise. So Bob, when people are looking for a lab, what are the one or two things that they should be looking for, knowing that they have to work with a lab? What are the one or two things that you would say, hey, these are the one or two things that you need to look for in a lab? And then Adam, the same thing when looking for labor counsel, what are the one or two things? So Bob?
Yeah, sure. So I'd say maybe it's one or two. Transparency, transparency, per transparency. The data is the grower processor's data. If you get any pushback from the laboratory and say, well, this is really confidential, I really can't show you how I do things, or I really can't show you the data, run as fast as you can. That's probably the first one. And the second one, we got a lot of very, very bright people doing cannabis testing. If one company has 80% or 90% of the business, be really wary, because at the end of the day, there's something else that may be going on. That would be the second thing I would mention.
That's great. That's great. So Adam, before you answer, Bob, I just want to ask, when you put your information out in the chat feature, if you could click everyone. So I think we saw your information because you had hosts and panelists before the other guests click everyone.
Thank you for
Adam,
my education.
So Adam, same question. When looking for labor counsel, what are the one or two things that we should be asking or looking for when selecting labor counsel?
Yeah, I'm very glad that you asked that question. And I also see I made the same mistake, not to call it a mistake there, Bob, but the same mistake, Bob, that I used mine for just hosts and panels. So I've just included a link to my bio since everybody heard enough about who I am, what I do. I do think it's critical to have experienced cannabis counsel and experienced labor counsel. I'll say this as a labor lawyer and employment lawyer, but particularly in the labor realm, it is very different than sort of a typical negotiation. And there are there's a lot of signaling. It's like walking into a poker game, right? They always say that if you walk into a poker game and you don't know who the sucker is, it's you. And the union negotiators I work with and the business agents are consummate professionals. They're very well educated. They're very good. And if you don't have somebody giving you advice so you can understand the implications, because typically they run out over 2 and 3 years in these contracts, you're going in with one hand tied behind your back. I cannot tell you how many times people have come to me with agreements with unions that they have negotiated, and there are implications to what they've agreed to that they just never understood, and they weren't reading the signs, and they missed it. So I think having experienced labor counsel is really, really critical. It's not something that you learn in a book. It's just something you learn by doing. Obviously learn a lot by the book, but a lot of the practical implications of these decisions and understanding what's being asked for and where there's opportunities to negotiate and where there aren't are really critical. You got to understand what those touch points are. So look for experience like you do in everything else, and make sure that you broadly stepping apart from my labor and employment world. I think broadly, when you look for counsel, this is a sophisticated area of practice, and there's lots of good lawyers doing this in New Jersey. But just make sure you find one of them with sophistication and with an understanding of the regulatory implications, the tax implications, the real estate, the environmental, the labor and employment, obviously, all of those things, because it's big business.
Great. Adam, thank you so much. Again, this is Ed DeVoe, president of the New Jersey Cannabis Business Association. I want to thank Bob Miller from ACT Labs. I want to thank Adam Gersh from Flaster Greenberg. Thank you both very much for sharing your knowledge with us today. I want to thank our sponsors, Hans Construction, Sprague Energy, our preferred energy company, Financial Resources Federal Credit Union, Curaleaf, Burton Trent Public Affairs, HBK Accounting, Township Green, new retailer, Proteus 420, Saks LLP, Dutchy, Puffin Entrepreneurs and Investors, soon to be opening retail, Canna Remedies, and DM Labs LLC. I want to thank you all so much. Please visit our website, NewJerseyCannabusiness.com. We want to thank you. Thank you, Jenna Ray Russo, our Deputy Executive Director, for producing today's program. Everyone have a great weekend, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thanks again for having us.
Thank you.